Hello and Happy New Year. It is great to be back. The Christmas break is usually a pretty boring time for news in Canada. Most politicians are on holidays, businesses slow down, and so the news media has to scramble for stories, which is why the organizers of the Idle No More protests were so smart. They knew the media, especially the Parliamentary Press Gallery, would be desperate for something to talk about over Christmas. So what a great time to launch a political campaign for maximum press coverage. Idle No More is a political protest about Aboriginal issues. The protest has taken a few different forms. In Victoria, British Columbia, there was a parade down a street. Okay, great. But in other places, it turned quickly to law-breaking. Like the blockade of the main CN Rail freight line north of Vancouver, or another blockade of CN Rail near Sarnia, or the blockade of Via Rail, the government passenger service, stranding thousands of travelers in eastern Ontario. Some of these blockades have lasted for more than a week, even though the railway got a court injunction that requires the police to clear the illegal blockades. The cops simply refused to enforce the law. Now, I don't know if they were scared to try or simply ordered not to try by politically correct police chiefs and politicians, maybe a bit of both. Now, that's shocking, though, in a country supposedly defined by our rule of law. But we should be used to this, right? I mean, ever since the Oka standoff in Quebec back in 1990, Canadian politicians of all stripes have chosen the cowardly policy of letting criminals violate Canadian law if they happen to be doing so in the name of Indian rights. Remember a few years ago when the Canadian border guards abandoned their posts on Cornwall Island because of Mohawk warrior threats? Canada actually ceded sovereignty over an entire island along the Canada-US border. Our border guards have never gone back. Or blocking a few thousand commuters by train. Well, remember, the Canadian government let the so-called Mohawk warriors blockade Montreal's Grand Mercier Bridge, one of the most important bridges in Canada's second largest city, for over a month. That bridge carries close to 100,000 cars a day. Now, politically correct politicians, and especially journalists, want every gun in the world registered these days, including low-powered things like duck hunters might use. But those noisy, nosy gun grabbers, for some reason, get pretty quiet when it comes to the military-style weaponry used at Oka or the Caledonia invasion and various standoffs in BC, like the armed seizure of a private ranch at Gustafson Lake in 1995. Look, it's frustrating. Such lawlessness and the media party's double standard about violence when it's committed by extremist Aboriginal politicians. Now, it reminds me of the Occupy Wall Street criminality of last year, where in cities across North America, a coalition of union activists, drug activists, anti-capitalist activists, and pretty much anyone looking to cause a ruckus set up gross little shanty towns in downtown parks. Now, where you and I would get arrested for camping overnight in a city park, police forces from New York to Calgary to Toronto just stood back while whole blocks of cities were turned into little islands of criminality for weeks and weeks. Not just little crimes like trespass and littering and drug use and public sex, but violent crimes, rapes, death by drug overdoses, and in some cases, murder and riots. I mention the Occupy movement because, well, like Occupy Wall Street, Idle No More is equally vague in what it wants to accomplish, other than they don't like things the way they are, and they want to show that by breaking the law, and that to pretend that their incoherent law-breaking protest is somehow morally superior to our democratic system of solving problems together as a society through elections and debates and votes and rules that we all follow. It's not a coincidence that both Idle No More and Occupy are law-breaking, vague, counterculture media creations, because they are organized and supported by the same people. I first encountered the Idle No More radicals last month in Toronto outside the investment conference sponsored by the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers. It was a protest organized and funded by the same union activists behind Occupy. In fact, if you recall, we even met two of the very same people at that Idle No More protest that we did when we visited the Occupy Toronto shantytown earlier in the summer. And both were coordinated and promoted by a union-funded activist website called rabble.ca. Idle No More and Occupy Toronto are both what we call AstroTurf organizations. They pretend to be grassroots movements, but they're artificial, bought and paid for with professionals with big PR budgets. Labor unions, environmentalist extremists, and anti-Harper groups have simply rebranded their hippie Occupy movement into an Indian Occupy movement. Now, Stephen Harper has a bit of a track record on Aboriginal affairs. In 2008, he issued a heartfelt apology on behalf of the government for the residential school system. Now, he's massively ramped up spending on Indian affairs. He regularly meets with chiefs, including a big powwow in Ottawa last year with about 100 chiefs. He counts a record number of Aboriginals in his caucus, as MPs and senators in his cabinet, too. Now, I disagree with the Harper government on their lack of courage to make the big change needed to scrap the racist Indian Act. But they are making other changes, like a bill called C-27, which would bring much-needed financial accountability to Indian bands, which are much more secretive than governments that the rest of us have to live under. Well, speaking of financial accountability, let us move to the star of the Idle No More protest. Like Occupy, it's pretty vague, so there was room for someone to come in and take it over and make it in her own image. Well, enter Theresa Spence, the chief of the Attawapiskat Indian Reserve in Northern Ontario. She's more media savvy than most. I mean, a year ago, she got the entire media party to do a series of sob stories about the rundown houses in her Indian band, which would be heartbreaking, other than the inconvenient fact that every household in Attawapiskat receives, on average, $250,000 a year between government subsidies and grants from the neighboring diamond mine. I mean, we'll talk more about the money later, but my point is that Theresa Spence is a master media manipulator, and she was extra smart this time. Instead of asking reporters to schlep up to Attawapiskat in the dead of winter, seriously, I checked, it's 33 degrees below zero up there today, she courteously came down to Ottawa and set up a teepee where the bored parliamentary press gallery could come and watch her, get this, have a hunger strike, like she's Mahatma Gandhi or the striking Irish Republican Army prisoners. She's been on this hunger strike for 23 days, so she says. But why? Well, because she wants to meet with Stephen Harper and the Crown, which means the Queen, or at least Canada's Governor General. And she's willing to die.
What's the purpose of this hunger strike, and to tell the government that why is he afraid to have a meeting with us? Like it's a simple request. It's just for a meeting, and the way he's acting as if we're asking more than that.
So a hunger strike to get a meeting, and she's willing to die to get that meeting. That's what a hunger strike means. You slowly starve yourself to death while the nation watches in horror, and you do it to bring attention to your cause. We'll talk about a dynamite political story. A Google News search that I did today shows there's nearly 12,000 news stories written about her hunger strike. She's a star. She's the face of the Idle No More movement. Celebrities like Justin Trudeau visit her for photo ops. She's the most interesting thing going on in Ottawa these days. She's what the Occupy movement lacked. A leader. No, not just a leader. A hero. Just ask the media party. I mean, she's a saint. And Stephen Harper is slowly murdering her by forcing her to starve to death just to get a meeting, when all she wants to do is stop the third world conditions on her reserve. Who wouldn't be moved by such a story? I mean, don't you care about the plight of Aboriginal people? Why? What? Are you racist? Well, except hang on. Is she really hunger striking? I mean, 23 days without food. Forgive me for saying it. She still looks well fed. And I say this as a fellow fatty. And hang on. Hasn't the Minister for Indian Affairs offered to meet with her and other Aboriginal politicians, and she's refused them because they're conservatives? Hang on. What's going on up there in Attawapiskat these days that she isn't talking about? You know, maybe there's more to being a journalist than doing the media party human interest stories about a brave woman in a teepee in Ottawa. Maybe there's some room here for some actual investigative journalism. This is where the media party, the consensus journalists, the parliamentary press gallery stops asking questions. But this is where we start. After the break, I'll ask you a few questions about Idle No More and Chief Theresa that you'll only find here on the Sun News Network. Hey, welcome back. Before the break, I told you the official party line about Idle No More, that it's a nationwide protest in the name of Aboriginal rights, that it's spilled over from just demonstrations into massive law-breaking and blockades. I told you a few things you might not have heard before, too, like the overlap between Idle No More and Occupy in terms of organizers, funders, and vague anti-Harper messaging. And of course, there's the hunger strike by Chief Theresa Spence of the Attawapiskat Indian Reserve. And before I go further, let me remind you what an Indian chief is. It's the title of an Indian politician. It's not a religious designation. It's not like a priest or a rabbi or a guru. It's a politician. And since the average Indian reserve has about 1,000 people on it, it's really like a small town mayor. Like I say, Attawapiskat has about 300 homes. So that's Theresa Spence, the boss of a 300-home community. And she's going on a hunger strike until, get this, she gets to meet with the Prime Minister, Stephen Harper. She's actually demanding a meeting that lasts a week or two, not just a day. Now, if your local small-town mayor did that, there would be a lot of questions like, what do you really want other than a meeting? And why don't you meet with the cabinet minister? And isn't this just a media stunt? And then someone might actually get a little bit journalistic-y and say, well, hang on. Since when did a hunger striker set up a donations page on Facebook, leading to a bank account in the name of her boyfriend? Let me give credit to Maclean's Magazine's Colby Kosh, a contrarian by nature, who dared to ask such an impertinent question. Colby, like me, is a big-boned man. We both shop at Huskytown, which is a nice way of saying we're plus-sized, like Chief Spence is. Now, whenever I try dieting in a serious way, like when I went on Atkins once, I lost some weight pretty quickly. I mean, when you're as fat as me, stopping eating is like taking your foot off the accelerator of a race car. The first 10 pounds come off in a week. Like I say, Chief Spence says she's been hunger striking for 23 days now, but here's a picture of her. She's positively Rubenesque. She's chubby. There's a lot of her to love. And I say that as a fellow snacker. Is that what hunger strikes really look like? Mahatma Gandhi went on hunger strikers to make a point, but none of his actually lasted 23 full days. His body just couldn't take it. Here's what a 14-day hunger striker looked like in the Caribbean recently. Look at how thin he is. And here's what a couple of 21-day hunger strikers looked like in Europe recently. They're gaunt. They're sickly. They don't have double chins. They're starting to look like those terrifyingly bony pictures of people in a famine. Let me show you the most recent picture of Chief Theresa again. Sorry, she's not hunger striking. She's pretending to hunger strike. Her boyfriend has set up a donations page. She's milking this as a PR stunt. She ain't hunger striking. Now, she's actually admitted that she's eating fish soup. That's right. She's apparently on a solid food strike, but media party will keep calling it a hunger strike. I remember when another fatty Toronto Mayor Rob Ford announced he was going to try to lose some weight, not for political purposes, just to get thinner. The media laughed at him, mocked him, and tracked his every pound. The Toronto Star even uploaded a video of him walking into Kentucky Fried Chicken. And no such skepticism by the media party with Chief Spence. They're happy to be used as part of her trick. They're happy to play their part, just like they were with the first incarnation of Occupy. Look, this is theater, bought and paid for by labor unions and anti-Harper activists. And of course, much of the media party is unionized and anti-Harper, so why not? Now, that might sound like a small point, but it's not. It goes to honesty and credibility. But more than that, being a hunger striker is a statement of commitment and sacrifice. You're saying that you're willing to commit suicide, to kill yourself, to make the ultimate sacrifice because your goal is so important and the system is just so unjust. That's why Gandhi did it. That's why the IRA terrorists in Northern Ireland did it. Now, we may or may not agree with them, but there was no denying it. They were willing to give up everything, painfully, to change the world. But what again does Chief Theresa want? A meeting with Stephen Harper? Do you think anyone in the world would starve to death for a meeting? Of course not. It's not a real goal. It's just about street theater like Occupy was. Has Chief Theresa ever sacrificed anything before? How about her luxuriant pay package as chief of a poor reserve? She wants us to believe that she'd sacrifice her life for her cause. How about just a few $1,000? Would she do that? I'll answer that later in the show. But look, if it wasn't Chief Theresa, it would be someone else. Oka had its frontman named Lasagna. He was the one who stared down a Canadian soldier. Chief Theresa, I should really call her Mayor Theresa, but even that is rather inflated. I mean, she's the boss of 300 homes. Mayor Theresa isn't the point here. The point is, what should we do about the alleged grievances of the Idle No More protests? And more immediately, what should we do about their illegal tactics? Well, the Ottawa Citizen, which calls itself Ottawa's newspaper of record, has made up its mind. Stephen Harper must appease Mayor Theresa. She's not just a mayor, reported the Citizen. She was the head of a, quote, sovereign nation. Seriously, the Citizen's reporter, sorry, I just can't say reporter, I've got to call her a stenographer. The Ottawa Citizen stenographer, Teresa Smith, reported with a straight face that, and I'm quoting here, quote, as the leader of a sovereign nation, Spence wants a nation-to-nation meeting with the leader of Canada, unquote. And the Citizen goes on to repeat, without criticism, Mayor Theresa's claims that Harper is violating the Indian treaties. Listen, if you can look a 200-pound woman in the eye without giggling as she tells you she's been on a 3-week hunger strike, you'll believe just about anything. But do you mind if we do a little fact-checking? I mean, we're just The Sun, a little tabloid media company. We're not the great Ottawa Citizen or anything, but do you mind if we fact-check that sovereign nation thing? I know what the word nation means. It's a group of people who have the same roots. Nation comes from the Latin word for birth. So in one sense, it's accurate to say that there are, in fact, 600 or so First Nations in Canada. They're little ethnic groups, some as small as a few hundred people, who share the same ancestry. It's a bit grandiose to use the word nation for that, but sure. But sovereign nation, that's what the Ottawa Citizen said. That means something else. That means a country like Italy or France. I mean, just for comparison, there are only 100 member nations of the United Nations in the whole world. So you can call yourself a First Nation, but you're not sovereign. But like I say, the Ottawa Citizen and the rest of the media party, they're not really much into reporting. I don't know more. Now, I'm not picking on the Citizen. That was just a particularly amazing act of propaganda there. But the rest of the media party is actually no better. The media party is more into cheerleading, either out of a shared distaste for Stephen Harper or just as likely a complete terror of being called politically incorrect or even racist if you dare ask Mayor Theresa to back up anything she says, or even just to explain what she means, or even ask why she's snacking during a hunger strike. Now, if you're in the media party, you don't dare ask questions like that. So what is the status of Mayor Theresa? Is she legally on par with Stephen Harper? Is her Indian reserve of 300 homes on equal standing with a country of 34 million people? Well, why don't we look at a contract that the Attawapiskat Indians signed in 1930 called Treaty 9. It actually was signed nation to nation, more or less. That's why it's called a treaty. Let me read a few excerpts from it for you. Here's the key part, I think. Here's where the Attawapiskat Indians give up their claim to national sovereignty. I'm going to quote now. The said Indians do hereby cede, release, surrender, and yield up to the government of the Dominion of Canada for His Majesty the King and his successors forever all their rights, titles, and privileges whatsoever to the lands, unquote. That's pretty categorical. There's no more legal or political or sovereign rights ever anymore. And no more complaints about it either. The treaty results in the, and I quote here, extinguishment of all their past claims, unquote. It's pretty clear. Attawapiskat is 300 houses. They can call themselves a nation. They can call themselves an empire. And Theresa the mayor can call herself empress for all I care. But it's just spin. But what if 82 years after they signed that treaty, the Indian band has a grievance? Well, the treaty's clear about that too. They can go to court or negotiate. Hell, they can even have a pretend hunger strike. But they can't break the law. Let me quote again. The undersigned Ojibwe, Cree, and other chiefs and headmen, on their own behalf and on behalf of all the Indians whom they represent, do hereby solemnly promise and engage to strictly observe this treaty, and also to conduct and behave themselves as good and loyal subjects of His Majesty the King, unquote. Well, how about blockading railway tracks or picking up a gun Mohawk warrior style? The treaty's got that covered too. It's a bit long, but I want to read it to you. This is the law. It's Indian law and Canadian law. It is the only law. And I quote, they promise and engage that they will in all respects obey and abide by the law, that they will maintain peace between each other and between themselves and other tribes of Indians, and between themselves and others of His Majesty's subjects, and that they will not interfere with or trouble any person passing or traveling through the said tract or any part thereof, and that they will assist the officers of His Majesty in bringing to justice and punishment any Indian offending against the stipulations of this treaty or infringing the law in force in the country so ceded. Got that? So no law breaking allowed. No Occupy Toronto, no Occupy Oka, no Occupy the Grand Mersey Bridge, no Occupy the CN Railway, no Occupy Via Rail. Who's really breaking the treaties here? But look, I've got a question still. Why Mayor Theresa? I mean, why her? What's her deal? Why does the mayor of such a small town make such a big fuss? What's this really about? Well, you will be amazed. I'll tell you the real story about Mayor Theresa and the missing millions. That's next. Don't you move a muscle. And welcome back. So we've got a mayor of 300 homes who says she's not just an Indian chief, but actually the boss of a sovereign nation. And she wants to meet nation to nation with Stephen Harper. Maybe she wants to join the G8 too. I bet there's some sumptuous state dinners there to break up the tedium of a hunger strike. That's my new thing now. Every night, immediately after my midnight snack, I go on a hunger strike. When I wake up, I'll take a quick breakfast. That's what the word break fast means. And then I'll get right back on the hunger strike. And I ain't just going to quit until, well, I don't know what I'm doing it for. But then again, I don't think Mayor Theresa knows either. Does she? Sometimes the media party digs into a story, sifts through thousands of pages of paper, examines every angle skeptically. Sometimes they do that for non-stories too. Take the 100 or so stories breathlessly published by the Ottawa Citizen about the so-called robocall scandal. It's a fake scandal. No one went to the wrong place to vote because of a malicious phone recording. It certainly didn't affect the election. It's all hype. But the Citizen has published 2 stories a week about it for a year. Now compare that to their complete lack of skepticism. No, the lack of even basic curiosity about financial and governance issues on a typical Indian reserve. Hell, not a typical reserve. How about the newsiest, most controversial reserve in the country, with a media hound as a boss? Imagine what the media party might find if they just asked a few basic questions of Theresa. No, not about her snacking, but about, well, where all the money's going? I'm not a member of the media party. I never went to journalism school. Unlike Peter Mansbridge, I'll never receive an Order of Canada. So I hope the reporter professionals don't mind if I ask a few questions that they haven't been asking. I've done this before, this kind of journalism that's banned on the CBC, like when we showed you this invoice for an Olympia brand ice resurfacer for $96,000. That's like a Zamboni. $96,000 plus shipping in the middle of the so-called housing crisis in Attawapiskat. Zamboni. It's, this is what they spent their money on. Remember this, you only would have seen it on the Sun because it contradicted the media party narrative about Stephen Harper starving Attawapiskat of much needed funds. Let me remind you that Attawapiskat already had an ice resurfacer and a modern hockey arena in Attawapiskat. They just wanted a newer ice resurfacer. They haven't bothered to rebuild their school up there, but damn it, they'd get their new ice resurfacer. It's not just the luxuries like that that are a shocking contrast to leaky shacks. Check out this band payroll. I remind you, an Indian band is just another fancy word for a town council. In this case, a town of 300 homes. Check it out, 3 chiefs on the payroll. That's like 3 mayors and 18 councillors. For a town of 300 families, they're all making full-time salaries. That's 21 full-time politicians for a town of 300 homes. And that's just Mayor Theresa and the aldermen. They also have a health authority and a school board and a power board and a development corporation and a corporation to run the hockey rink. And then they have a full-time staff of civil servants. There are probably 100 government jobs in town altogether. And these jobs don't pay chicken feed. I mean, in 2007, for example, band manager George Lanouette earned $173,000. How the hell did you get a gig like that? In the same year, Mike Gull made $126,000 as the technical services manager. What does that even mean? And why does it pay so much in a town of 300 homes that are shacks? $100,000, $200,000. And remember, you don't pay income tax when you're on a reserve. In 2011, acting manager of the town, Wayne Turner, managed to run up more than $68,000 in travel expenses in just 2 months. How do you even do that? Is there a private jet somewhere? Now, I showed you what the chiefs make officially, and I mean chiefs, plural. As you saw, there were 3 chiefs on the payroll last year, but there's another $11.2 million in salaries that are just lumped together and called wages and employee benefits, and another $3.1 million paid to, quote, administration, and another $12.4 million to, quote, program delivery. That's enough for a government job for every home in Attawapiskat. Oh, but then there's the welfare checks too. $450,000 a month in welfare pours into the town. In other words, $1,500 a home every month. But a lot of money doesn't even flow through the official band government. It's hived off into something called the Attawapiskat First Nation Trust. Every 3 months, the local diamond mine pours $500,000 into it. So the Indian band invested in stocks and bonds. It's quite a group of high rollers, really. Nearly $9 million in the stock market now. They own everything from bank stocks to oil companies to even oil sands pipeline companies. I admire their fine taste. They own shares in Apple Computers, in Disney, in Chinese cell phone companies. They are rich. They are super rich. But instead of, say, selling some of that to fix their leaky houses, they just demand more money from Ottawa. See what I mean? I mean, if Mayor Theresa, the stock market tycoon Theresa, was about sacrifice, as a hunger strike implies she is, maybe she'd sell some of those corporate bonds to buy a house or 2 for her fellow reserve members, but she doesn't. And the media don't ask her questions about it. Oh, they do cash out some stocks from this fund from time to time. Last year, they spent $200,000 on gifts, and they spent $36,000 on goose hunting. Must be nice. You wouldn't think there's a housing crisis in a town that spends like that. But hey, according to their own financial statements, they've been running multi-million-dollar surpluses there, year after year. So hey, why not spend like Wall Street bankers in 2008? Now, we're almost out of time, but let me just raise two more points. I showed you the name Clayton Kennedy before. That's Teresa's boyfriend. He's the one collecting money through Facebook for her hunger strike. He's also the town manager. He gets paid $850 a day for that through his company. $850 a day. And Teresa, the chief, his girlfriend, makes about $70,000 a year. So that's about $250,000 a year for these two lovebirds, tax-free. Now, I've spent 15 minutes poking through all this publicly available material, and I found a scandal here. I found luxurious spending, tycoon-like investments, and plenty of back-scratching going on. I found millions in surpluses and hundreds of thousands of dollars in gifts. And yet the media party just wants to talk about how Stephen Harper is to blame for the fact that there are leaky roofs up there. But let me close with a fun one. Now, I've called her Empress Teresa. I've called her Mayor Teresa. Her real title is Chief Theresa, but the media treat her like Mother Teresa. Now, she's the chief. Her boyfriend is the band manager. They're rich. I've called her Theresa Spence, as do most of the media. She used to be the deputy chief for the reserve a few years ago, but back then the deputy chief was called Teresa Linkletter. Theresa Spence's daughter, last name is Linkletter, Thesalicia Linklater. You can see the signatures here. Are they the same person? Their signatures sure look the same on the document. It's no big deal. I mean, some people change their names, especially if they're married and then divorced. We put a call into Attawapiskat to confirm it. It's no big deal. I just want to be sure. Because here's the thing. Teresa Linklater has also billed the Attawapiskat government. For example, she was paid $25,000 to work for 3 months as the daycare manager up there. Now stop for a second and do the math. $25,000 to be a daycare manager in a town of about 1,500 people for 3 months' work. Now, what other payments does Teresa Linklater take? Does she still take any under that name? What other payments does Theresa Spence take from these various corporations? Are there any of those many millions in the salaries and wages and administration and gifts that went to her or her boyfriend Clayton? I really don't know. Because Indian bands don't have the same disclosure as non-Indian town councils do. I'd love to ask Theresa Spence or Teresa Linklater or Empress Teresa or Skinny Teresa or whatever about this. But for some reason, she prefers to talking to the stenographers and the media party over question askers from the Sun. I'm mad about this, but I'm not surprised. I'm mad about the grotesque waste of money in Attawapiskat. I'm mad, but not surprised at the total lack of curiosity in the consensus media, either out of ideological solidarity or simple fear of being called racist. There are leaky houses in Attawapiskat despite their jet-set lifestyle. I blame the chief and her $850 a day financial manager boyfriend. I blame Stephen Harper for not cracking down on corruption in Indian reserves. But I also blame the media party for running defense for chiefs like Teresa. Teresa is not the victim here. Hundreds of thousands of Indians, not rich Indians, not millionaire chiefs and their boyfriends, but regular Indians, the 99% of them, they're the real victims. That's who I care about. I want reform of Canada's reserves, starting with Attawapiskat. Because every dollar that went to Zambonis and goose hunts and buying stocks and bonds is a dollar that did not go to fix the plumbing or the leaky roof. And that truly is a national scandal.